In September 2017, 32-year-old Jasmine Kensington set off on a solo hike in the Appalachian Mountains. It was supposed to be a few days of peace and freedom, but she never made it out of the mountains. Search parties worked for weeks. Dogs sniffed trails, helicopters circled the ridges, but no trace was found. The car remained on the side of the road, and Jasmine seemed to have vanished into the dense forest. For her brother, Eden, that day marked the beginning of years of sleepless nights. 6 years later, in 2023, an expedition accidentally picked up a strange signal coming from under the rocks near a hidden cave. But back then, in the early days of September, no one knew that the story would take such a terrifying turn. At 9:20, she was supposed to send a short message. "I'm on the ridge. Everything's fine." It was a simple agreement with her brother to keep him calm, the same ritual Jasmine had followed for years. At 9:30, Eden's phone screen was still blank. At 9:42, he dialed the number for the first time. The forest swallowed the ringing. Eden stood in the kitchen, leaning his hands on the edge of the table, looking out the window, where the morning mist was swirling between the hills. On the table lay a crumpled note in her handwriting. "Start at the trail to Gray Outcrop, then to the ledge on the north ridge. Back along the trail along the stream. I'll be back by evening." Her notes were always precise, almost like a blueprint. She was an architect, but also someone who planned everything, from her route to the number of matches in her waterproof bag. That's why the blank screen of his phone seemed more than just alarming. It was wrong. At 10:17, he was already driving towards the mountains. The asphalt turned into narrow serpentines, and fog stretched along the edges of the forest like spilled chalk. The car radio hissed with local news about moderate winds on the ridge and a slight drop in temperature after noon. Eden caught himself thinking it was funny. He wanted the announcer to suddenly add, "And tell Jasmine she's expected home." He dialed her again at the turn where he always got a signal. Beeps. Pause. Nothing. It was cool in the visitor center, smelling of old print and raincoats. Behind the counter sat a ranger with a square jaw and a short Gareth Malloy patch. He spoke calmly, like people who had seen a lot of anxiety in others. "Departure time?" Gareth asked, nodding at the note. "She left at dawn. Around 6, I think. She was supposed to reach the ridge and return before dark." "We always do that." Eden's voice broke on the word always. "Did she sign the trail log?" "Yes, and she updated her route on her offline map. I saw her mark the points." "The phone could run out of battery," Gareth said without judgment, and unfolded the map. "But it's good that she gave specifics. Our teams will go in 2 directions, along the upper trail and along the stream. Let's ask for volunteers. We'll send a helicopter as soon as the fog clears." He said, "We," and it gave the illusion of control. Eden signed the missing person report and sat in the lobby answering the standard questions: height, clothing, shoes, how much water she had taken. He even took the guidebook with Jasmine's notes on wet weather gear out of his backpack. They had laughed at that word last night when she had checked his equipment in front of him and cursed the old carabiners. Everything starts to lie in damp conditions. Now that phrase came back to him like a cold shard. The first group left at 11. The forest, which had seemed welcoming during the day, became an obstacle in the search grid. The level trails on the map narrowed in reality to narrow, damp corridors between rhododendrons. The rocks forced them to take small steps so as not to slip on the scree. Every 20 minutes, short whistles sounded, and the dogs worked silently, conserving their strength. Eden walked with the second group. The ranger allowed him on the condition that he would not interfere. He did not interfere. He just looked at the ground and tried to distinguish any of her little details from the chaos of the mountain features. The day unfolded slowly. The mixed smell of wet bark, damp earth, and gasoline from the ATVs made his head spin. One of the volunteers, a woman with short hair named Sloane, repeated quietly several times. She could have just walked to the next ridge and sat there. It happens. Don't beat yourself up. Eden nodded. But it was precisely that "it happens" that stuck in his throat. It had never happened to Jasmine. Closer to noon, the fog did indeed lift, and the helicopter made 2 wide circles over the North Ridge. From below, there was a changing rumble, like a heartbeat under metal. The pilot reported over the radio. No visual signals, nothing that stands out in color. Gareth thanked him briefly and turned off the microphone. Eden sat on a rock and tried to swallow something for the first time that day. The cracker crumbled to dust between his fingers. In the evening, headquarters was set up in a wooden pavilion near the information stand. Thermoses, markers, and printouts with search sector squares appeared on the tables. When it seemed that nothing more would happen, a young volunteer with the call sign Ted came on the radio, his voice hoarse. "I have a trail." "No, it's not a trail. Sorry. Just a wet paw print. A bear." Gareth just pressed his lips together. What gave them hope every hour took it away every 10 minutes. Night in the mountains is strange. When the generators are turned off and everyone speaks more quietly, the silence is not liberating. It is oppressive. Eden sat on a bench in front of the pavilion and looked at the black slope opposite. He knew these places. He and Jasmine had grown up with these contours, learned to navigate by the ridge line, knew where the first frost fell. He knew her pace, her habit of bringing new people into her life as if into a house with high ceilings. He also knew that she was no hero and no fan of reckless risks. She just loved the mountains the way you love silence. Without romance, but sincerely. On the second day, 2 more groups joined them. The water in the stream was colder than usual for this time of year. A dog named Credo sniffed warily at a crumpled blackberry bush several times, but the scent disappeared. Canned food was distributed for lunch, but no one ate it. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Gareth received a short message from the technician. The last confirmed ping from her phone was at 8:30 yesterday, at a spot between the tree trunks that the locals called Long 7. Then there was silence. A map with a red dot that explained nothing. Twilight returned suddenly. The clouds that had hung over the ridge all day closed in so low that the tops of the pines disappeared beneath them, as if they had been cut off. On the way to the pavilion, Eden noticed a familiar face, Nathan, the same one who was supposed to go with Jasmine but stayed because of a fever. He arrived, glancing at everyone, and stood quietly beside him, not touching him. They both looked at the map, where Gareth was marking new squares with a marker. Nathan said something about, "She always made time," and "She couldn't go down the scree. It's dangerous." Eden didn't answer. It was physically difficult for him to hear someone say, "She couldn't," when the fact was that she was gone. When the third evening came, Gareth asked Eden to come behind the screen at the end of the pavilion. It was less crowded there. The ranger took off his cap and rubbed his forehead for a moment, as if clearing away extra words. "I'll be blunt. We're going to continue. The night teams will go too. Tomorrow, we'll bring in more people from the surrounding area. But there's a rule, and I have to tell you what it is. The first 72 hours are our best chance. After that," he paused, searching for a way to phrase it that wouldn't cut so deeply. "After that, the odds drop, sharply." The word "drop" hit him like a cold blast. At first, Eden just nodded, as if agreeing with the math. Then he swallowed again, feeling his throat refuse to obey him. Then, the sound escaped on its own. He didn't cry ostentatiously. On the contrary, he tried to press his palm against his mouth, but it came out broken, short, unpleasant, alive. "Don't tell me that." His voice came out hollow and too loud for the empty cubicle. "Don't you dare say chances. This isn't about odds. This is my sister. This is Jasmine. Do you understand?" Gareth paused and didn't look away, which was the only right thing to do at that moment. "I understand," he said simply. "That's why we don't stop. And that's why I'm telling you the truth. Because the truth helps you act in time." Eden turned away, resting his forehead against the rough plywood. He was breathing heavily, as if he had just run a race, while the night outside the wall breathed evenly and indifferently. He suddenly felt ashamed of his outburst, but the shame boiled away and faded like water on hot metal. He had been right. He thought that if he didn't let it out now, those words, that sound, they would get stuck and prevent him from sleeping or moving. When he came out from behind the screen, 2 night shifts were already settling down on the floor of the pavilion. Someone was checking the batteries for the headlamps. Someone was rewinding old shoe covers with tape. Sloan placed a metal mug of coffee in his hands. The coffee was bitter, like everything that has no taste when you're waiting for news, but the warmth of the mug did something useful. It reminded him that he still had his hands and feet, and that tomorrow they would go back into the forest. He sat down by the entrance, where a thin chill came through the cracks in the boards. Strangers' phrases from the day stuck in his head. The battery might die. Let's go along the stream. Last ping. The first 72 hours. And on top of all that was her voice from last night, when she stuffed a bag of ginger cookies into her backpack. "If I'm late, don't worry, Eden. I know what I'm doing." He didn't answer her then, just looked up and memorized how the light from the lamp reflected off the metal ring on her backpack. In the darkness, someone whispered, "Are you going to sleep?" Eden shook his head. Sleeping meant admitting that time was passing. He took her small compass with scratched glass out of his pocket, a souvenir from their childhood that had been lying in a drawer for many years. Jasmine always laughed that carrying old things around was sentimental, but sentimentality is also a tool, she added spitefully. He twirled the compass in his fingers, watching the needle tremble and finally point north, as if there were some answer in these tiny movements. It rained again during the night, uncertain, light, more like drizzle. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked briefly and fell silent. The mountains breathed like a giant body, and this indifferent regularity was more soothing than any words. Eden suddenly realized that tomorrow he would go to the northern section with Gareth's group, despite his fatigue. He would go not out of hope, not even out of despair. He would go because it was the only thing that had any shape now. Everything else was numbers, probabilities, strangers' voices, and the trail was the ground he could walk on. He closed his eyes for a few seconds and saw her as he had seen her hundreds of times before. Her back in a gray jacket, her steady stride, her hand brushing a strand of hair from her face as it slipped under her hood. He said quietly and clearly, "Stay where you are." And for the first time in 2 days, it sounded not like a plea to the heavens, but like an instruction. The kind Jasmine always wrote in her notebooks. Morning would come, and they would leave again. But tonight would be remembered for that short cry behind the screen and the bitter taste of coffee. And also for the way the compass needle, having no power over the mountains, stubbornly pointed north, just as he would stubbornly keep his course until told otherwise. The morning began without fanfare, with the simple click of switches in the wooden pavilion where tables had been set up during the night. A map of the ridges was hung on one table, and printouts with square grid sectors on another. Ranger Gareth Malloy wearily smoothed his collar and placed the starter plan for the first operational period on the table with his palm. Thermoses fogged up nearby like lanterns in the fog. The air smelled of wet wood and marker. Eden sat to the side, holding her fleece jacket, a spare with the tag still attached, which Jasmine had never removed. Last night, he had gone home and picked up the item that retained her purest scent. The dog, named Credo, carefully took the scent sample, inhaled deeply, blinked, and froze, as if remembering someone personally. The conductor nodded. "It's working. We have the last known location among the pine trees, which the locals call Long 7, Gareth summed up briefly. The last signal from her phone was there yesterday morning. We'll start from there and fan out. Top, along the ridge, bottom, along the stream, third group, cut off the scree above the cliff. Wait for the drones until the haze clears. Keep the radio code simple. Sectors by letter, squares by word." The words "simple code" sounded reassuring, but everything else was far from simple. The slopes here were good at forming a convenient map and at the same time hiding such depressions under thick rhododendrons that a person could disappear 3 steps from the trail. The tangled laurel thickets squeezed into narrow corridors, and sound died away after a few dozen steps. In such terrain, help existed only where it stood. The first group set off before everyone else. Their helmets were covered in thin scratches. Their eyes had the look of night shifts. Their whistles barely touched the air before dissolving. The second group waited for permission to move. The third was commanded by Gareth himself. A short man with a square jaw, marked by dozens of such mornings. Sloane pulled out a roll of signal tape and walked alongside Eden, who was allowed to bring up the rear of the water line. There was only one rule: watch and stay silent until told to speak. The beginning always creates the illusion of control. A line of orange tape between the bushes, radio communications, short Roger and acknowledged responses that add backbone. Hour after hour, it turns into a rhythm similar to whipping cream. Hands go numb, the sound becomes monotonous, and the result is nowhere in sight. The path along the stream wound as if trying to avoid all human eyes. Credo stopped again and again, took in the scent of the stone, crossed to the other side, and retreated again, as if something in the air was tearing at a thin thread. Iden walked carefully, stopping at every little thing that could be a clue. Bark that had been recently stripped away, a barely noticeable groove from a stick, a chip on a rock that seemed fresher than the others. He already knew how quickly the eye begins to invent confirmation, because he wanted, painfully, to see what might not be there. Closer to noon, the fog lifted, and the sky, like an unbuttoned cloak, released 2 drones into the air. They were given a route over the ridges and along the edges of the scree. On the monitor near the headquarters, the black and green texture of the forest floated slowly, like an old movie. Nothing that stood out in color. Nothing that screamed human. Gareth reported briefly, "Reinforce the ridge. Check all the ledges under the cliff. If she fell and managed to slide into cover, there might be microtraces left behind, a thin stick for a fire, a tuft of thread, a carabiner badge." He spoke calmly, like a man who had torn hope away from the unknown many times. His "there might be" sounded like, "we have no right to anything else." Nathan appeared without moving, like a shadow between the trees. Gray and exhausted, he asked not to fall behind the group. They let him go, but not ahead. It turned out that he and Eden were walking side by side, not looking at each other. From time to time, Nathan squeezed the strap of his backpack, as if that would help him gather all his words together. He was one of the few who knew Jasmine in the mountains as well as Eden did, and that made his silence even heavier. After lunch, false hope flared up. There was a tire mark on the clay under a rock ledge. "Fresh?" someone asked over the radio. "Fresh," came the reply. Everyone held their breath. A few minutes later, another voice, calm and cold as spring water, said, "It's ours." The rescuer's foot had passed a meter above the spot. They marked it, took a photo, and moved on. They didn't allow themselves to get their hopes up, not wanting to slow down the pace. At the same time, another front line was working in the pavilion. The dispatcher called the communications operators to get the extended tower logs faster. The district lawyer helped to obtain permission to access the fitness app data. Generators rumbled, and tea and plastic cups tasted like metal. New sheets appeared on the wall, a finer grid, additional high-probability zones where the water had washed away everything that wasn't firmly attached. The long 7 mark was covered with arrows, like a hub on an old subway map. Eden returned to headquarters just as the first wave of people was changing. He didn't sit down on a chair, but on the edge of a bench, as if afraid to occupy something stationary. Gareth placed a form with a grid in front of him. Consent to ping and backup contacts. "It's standard," he said, "and it works." Eden signed, writing a few lines. Addresses, names of those authorized to collect identified items, if he didn't allow himself to finish the thought. His hand returned the pen to its place anyway. In the afternoon, Credo suddenly pulled harder than before. The wind had changed, or the smell had condensed in some micro-vortex, but the dog led them to a narrow crevice between 2 boulders. Sloane crouched down and shone her light into the cavity. Nothing. Only dry leaves, a little mouse droppings, and the old bone of some small animal. Credo sat down, looked into the darkness, sighed, as if admitting defeat. The guide stroked him behind the ear. "Okay, let's keep going." Towards evening, they started talking about the weather again. A thin veil was drawing over the ridge, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. The night groups were preparing to search the nearest ledges and shine their lights into several problematic corridors. The drones were put away. The batteries go haywire in the cold. Gareth gave a short briefing. "No heroics. If you encounter darkness that cannot be illuminated, turn back. 10 minutes after midnight, check in." During a break between reports, Sloane quietly placed a plastic container of soup on Eden's desk. "You need to eat. Staying alive is a strategic resource." He nodded and silently swallowed a few spoonfuls. The food had no taste, but it restored his sense of his body. He looked at the map, where thick markers had grown like roots, and caught himself thinking that each line was someone else's hope, drawn by hand. When it got dark, the light from the headlamps reflected in the droplets, as if someone had hung miniature mirrors on the bushes. The first night pair passed a short vertical section. The second examined the entrance to a shallow cavity under an overhanging rock. Each group's report was similar to the previous one, like fingerprints from the same hand. Only the details differed. The smell of algae in the stream, the old campfire of other travelers, a hawk's feather between the stones. Jasmine did not appear among these layers. At midnight, there was a click on the radio, a check-in. The voices sounded exhausted but kept their tone, like a conductor keeping the tempo when the orchestra is tired. Gareth turned off the radio and looked at Eden. "I'll be blunt. Tomorrow we'll add the 8s to the north and go higher. We'll make an exception and scan 2 scree slopes with rope insurance. Request another K9 team, and push the analysts on the towers. What if—" Eden didn't finish. His throat tightened again, But the scream that had come out during the day had already done its job. All that remained was a rough residue. We'll deal with that too," Gareth replied bluntly. "But right now, we're working with what we have." After the check, practical silence filled the air again. Someone was taping up torn shoe covers with duct tape. Someone was drying gloves on the warm generator radiator, as if that could change tomorrow's outcome. In the corner, indicators flashed quietly, as if these electronic bugs knew something that humans did not. Closer to dawn, the first night shift returned, while the second was still out in the field. Eden froze in the doorway, listening to the footsteps. Always two, an echo and a repeat. When the door opened, 3 people entered the pavilion. One of them was carrying a torn garbage bag slung over his shoulder, containing wet socks, a plastic bottle cap that didn't belong to him, and a piece of rope with a broken knot. These were trifles that would be thrown away in a peaceful world, but in this reality, they were treasured like meteorite fragments. They sorted them on the table, dried them, dripped them with luminol, but nothing human remained. Outside, a mist settled on the grass so thickly that his feet were instantly soaked. Eden took a few steps away from the headquarters and stopped, breathing in the cold air. The mountains breathed evenly, just like the day before. He remembered how he and Jasmine used to compete as children to see who could throw a stone farther into the stream, and how they laughed at the sound of the splash, which seemed like proof of victory. Now he wanted at least a sound. Any sound. The mountains remained silent, deaf and impartial. At dawn, the second operational period began. There were noticeably more people than yesterday, arriving from neighboring districts. They brought new radios, folding stretchers, rolls of thermal blankets, and another suitcase for evidence. Journalists were not allowed in yet. The official position was simple. The search continues. And that was the truth, without adjectives. The analyst handed Gareth a thin envelope. The towers had confirmed that the last strong signal came from the sector near Long 7, followed by a series of weak ghosts, probably reflections that meant nothing. It was not a victory, but it was a coordinate, and coordinates are what allow you to move in this world. Before leaving, Gareth held Eden's gaze. "Let's do one more thing. I'm going to ask you to tell us everything you know that only you know. Her little habits. How often does she stop to drink water? Does she switch her backpack from one shoulder to the other when she gets tired? Does she hate wet sleeves? Things like that. Sometimes they're better than a map. It was painful and right." Eden spoke as if he were drawing a technical plan, briefly, to the point, without romanticism. She hates it when her socks are wet. She changes them if she can. She always keeps matches in 2 waterproof bags, not just one. When it's cold, she doesn't go straight into her sleeping bag, but first does 20 squats to warm up. She spreads her food around different pockets. Sloane wrote all this down with a pencil that was already shorter than her finger. The second day did not promise miracles. It promised work. The groups set out again. The ridge, the scree, the stream. No one spoke in the future tense. Everyone used the present. It helped. When a sliver of sun appeared on the horizon, it did not make the world a kinder place, but it gave shape to the shadows. And shape is also information. At the end of this day, they will return with a new layer of sterile bags and new nothing yet, but also with a more precise understanding of where exactly this nothing is no longer. The task is not only to find a person. The task is to cut the unknown into pieces until all that remains is a path, narrow as a crack between stones, but real. And if that path exists, they will find it. Because that is what searching is for. taking steps where they are not expected, and returning where logic does not call. The first step has been taken. The mountains are still silent, but the first, second, and third circles have already been drawn on their silence. And somewhere between them, in one of these squares, where no foot has yet trod and no tape has rustled, her traces may still lie. September mornings in the Appalachians always had their own austere beauty. Fog spread across the ravines like frozen smoke, and the dawn light filtered through the branches of tall oaks and pines, making each step of the searchers seem like movement in a strange, unfriendly world. The second week of the operation was coming to an end, but the result was the same. Nothing. People strayed from the trails, checking every ravine, every crack in the rocks, every spot where water collected after rain. Dogs followed the scent of her t-shirt, taken from her home, but after a few hundred meters, the trail disappeared into the wet grass. A helicopter hovered over the treetops, but the green sea of trees revealed nothing. It seemed impossible. An experienced tourist couldn't just disappear as if she had been wiped off the map. Even if she had been injured, she would have left her belongings, footprints, traces in the ground. But here, there was nothing. The only ones who left any tangible signs of their presence were the searchers themselves. Their boots pressed into the moss, their bright fabric ribbons hung from the branches, marking the squares they had searched. Jasmine's brother, Eden, walked among them, leaning on a map, but his eyes were empty. He had heard the rangers say in hushed tones more than once, "Even if she fell, we would have found something. A piece of clothing, a bag, a scrap of food." Those words made his heart sink. He begged them to dig deeper, to search further, but he could see the exhaustion in their eyes. On the 8th day, there was a glimmer of hope. One of the volunteers found a piece of fabric tangled in the thorny branches above the swampy riverbed. It was bright turquoise, just like the jacket Jasmine was wearing that day. Eden, hearing this, literally clung to the radio, demanding immediate confirmation. The groups threw all their forces into the search, crawling through the mud, checking the banks, but the result was the same: disappointment. The fabric turned out to be a piece of an old fisherman's vest, lost by someone many years ago. 2 days of hope vanished into thin air. The people returned to base, wet, bitten by insects, empty-handed. Some cursed quietly, others threw their backpacks into the trunk of the jeep with such irritation that it seemed they wanted to forget this story forever. The weather also changed. A prolonged rain fell on the mountains, the sky hung low with clouds, and even the powerful headlights were lost in the gloom. Leaves stuck to their faces, and the paths turned into slippery streams. Each day of fruitless searching only intensified the sense of absurdity. People trampled hectares of forest, but it was as if they were looking for a ghost. Eden sat under the headquarters awning at night and listened to the radios crackling in the void. Ranger Frank Miller, gray-haired with a perpetually tanned face, sat down next to him and sighed helplessly. "We've covered over 100 square miles. Not a trace. This can't be happening." His words were meant to be a statement of fact, but to Eden, they sounded like a death sentence. He stood up, kicked his chair away in anger, and shouted, "She's alive! She couldn't just disappear. You don't understand. She's my sister." No one argued. People looked away because they knew that this cry was despair that could no longer be contained. The 12th day brought even worse news. Forecasters warned of a cyclone, 3 days of continuous rain. That meant the end. The currents would wash away any traces, helicopters would not be able to take off, and it was dangerous to keep people in the mountains. An official silence descended on the headquarters. Everyone knew what would happen next. An announcement that the active operation had been called off. Eden looked into the damp darkness and realized that soon he would be alone. Just him and the silence of the mountains. The morning of the 14th day did not begin with the usual footsteps of dogs or the crackle of radios. It began with a heavy silence that even the rain could not break. The mountains had worn everyone down, those who walked their paths and those who sat in headquarters staring at maps. Now there was only one thing in the air. The end was near. Ranger Gareth Malloy, always reserved and dry in his words, came out under the canopy where Eden was sitting. He didn't start talking for a long time, just staring at the dark strip of trees disappearing into the fog. Finally, he said, "We've done everything we could." Last night, district headquarters made a decision. Only one group will remain in the morning. The rest are being sent home. The words hung in the air like a sentence. Eden didn't even react at first. He just stared at the damp ground beneath his feet. His fingers convulsively clenched the strap of his backpack, and inside, he was boiling. "You say you're closing it? Like a report?" His voice broke, and he looked up sharply at the ranger. "She's there. She's waiting. And you? You're going home to sleep in your warm beds." Malloy didn't flinch, just sighed and lowered his shoulders slightly. "We're not going of our own free will. It's a question of resources, time, and chances." That last word burned Eden. He slammed his fists on the table, and a hoarse, almost animal cry escaped his throat. A depressing pause fell over the pavilion. Some of the volunteers looked away, others nervously adjusted the straps on their shoulders. Everyone felt that it was not just a person speaking. It was the pain that they had all seen, but were afraid to voice. That day, the search operation was indeed called off. The tents were taken down, and the cards with maps of the sectors were carefully removed from the walls. The generator fell silent, and with it, the illusion that the struggle would continue here faded away. Eden stood aside, watching the cars leave the site one by one. Once, this noise and bustle had seemed like a guarantee to him. As long as the headquarters was working, as long as people were in the mountains, there was a chance. Now, all that remained was the wind blowing wet leaves down the path. Some of the rescuers came over to say goodbye. Sloan, a volunteer with short hair, hugged him and said quietly, "Hang in there. This doesn't mean it's over. It's just that, right now, we're giving up." Eden was silent. He didn't have the strength to respond. He just watched her silhouette disappear into the fog along with the others. That evening was the darkest of all. Only a few local volunteers and a small group of rangers remained in the pavilion. On the tables were scattered mugs of cold coffee and a few maps that were no longer needed. The atmosphere was reminiscent of the aftertaste of defeat, which was harder to bear than the struggle itself. Eden sat alone, her old compass, which he had carried in his pocket since the first day of the search, lying in front of him. The needle trembled, and he caught himself thinking, could this tiny toy know more than dozens of people with modern equipment? But of all the things he had, it was the only thing that gave him the illusion of direction. When darkness finally enveloped the valley, he went outside. The mountains stood like black walls, water dripping from them. Not a single light, not a single echo of a human voice. He felt tears welling up in his eyes, but this time he didn't hold them back. He stood there, clenching his teeth, and through the downpour, sobs escaped him, dissolving into the night air. The next morning, it was officially announced that the active phase of the search was over. The news reported the standard phrases, "The operation was large-scale. Over 300 people were involved. There are no results. To journalists, it sounded dry and clear, but to Eden, it was like a blow to the head. He knew that these words were closing the door behind his sister. The headquarters was now quiet. Several rangers were packing their gear, while others loaded equipment into a pickup truck. Eden approached Gareth Malloy, who was checking the equipment list. "What's next?" His voice was quiet, but it carried the same desperate, don't give up tone. "The case is going cold. There will be minimal monitoring. If we find a new lead, we'll come back," the ranger replied. Eden felt a wave of anger rising inside him again. He wanted to shout, but instead he whispered, "She's in there, and you're just leaving her." Malloy didn't answer. He just lowered his eyes slightly and silently placed his hand on Eden's shoulder. That silence was more honest than any explanation. Eden didn't return to the motel that night. He stayed at the empty headquarters. He sat on a damp bench, wrapped in his jacket, and stared into the darkness. The rain had stopped, leaving behind the smell of wet earth and bitter frost. He replayed every minute of those days in his head. His first call, when the phone was silent, the ranger's voice saying, "The odds are against you," the false hope for a piece of cloth. Sloane's words as she hugged him before he left. It all blended into a kaleidoscope, where the truth was drowned out by noise and silence, became the most terrifying enemy. By morning, he had climbed a small ridge nearby, where he could see the valley below. Fog was once again enveloping the lowlands, and the peaks looked like islands in the sea. There, lost in that sea, was Jasmine. Eden stood, clutching the compass in his hand, and whispered, "I won't stop. Even if everyone else leaves, I'll stay." The end of the search was the point at which his own silent investigation began. For everyone else, the case became just another unresolved file. For him, it became a life without sleep or rest. The mountains had taken his sister, but he felt that they were hiding something else. And he would find it, even if he had to search for years. Because the scariest thing in the mountains is not a storm, not a beast, and not darkness. The scariest thing is the silence that remains in place of traces. And that silence was now his only companion. 2 years passed, but for Eden, time did not have its usual rhythm. Calendars changed, seasons came and went, but it all looked like a background film playing on its own. For him, time began counting down from that September morning when his sister didn't answer the phone. Since then, every day had been a variation on the same scene. Him staring at his phone screen, which stubbornly remained silent. The official case had long been shelved in the archives. The report stated in black and white, "Missing, active investigation closed, no traces found." For the system, that meant there were no more priorities. But for Eden, it was just the beginning. He returned to the Appalachians again and again, first every weekend, then less often, but still regularly. He bought maps, marked routes with red lines, and set off into the same thickets where hundreds of people had once walked. Sometimes volunteers went with him, but mostly he wandered alone. His friends turned away. He took time off work, which turned into weeks of absence. His boss once said bluntly, "Listen, you're going where there's nothing left. You're just torturing yourself." Eden didn't answer, because it's impossible to explain. When your sister disappears without a trace, you can't let go. Because even a mountain has no right to wipe a person off the face of the earth like that. In the summer of the second anniversary, his anxiety intensified. The newspapers wrote about another disappearance in the same region. This time, the victim was a young woman who had gone on a short hike and never returned. Unlike Jasmine's case, her body was found a few days later at the bottom of a ravine. The official version: an accident, a fall from the trail. But the news itself was like a shock. Eden read these lines at night, sitting at the kitchen table. He felt a new scenario spinning in his head. What if it wasn't nature at work, but a person? What if there was someone hunting? Someone who knew where and how to disappear so that the search would yield nothing. He set off for the mountains the following week. The place where the new victim was found was dozens of miles from Jasmine's route. But that didn't matter to him. He wandered through the thickets again, staring at the rocks as if some kind of code was written there. His feet sank into the mud. His hands were cut by thorns. But he kept going. On one of these trips, Eden first met a detective named Lewis Harris. He was a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a notebook that was always sticking out of his pocket. He introduced himself briefly. "I'm from the county, working on a new case." Tension immediately arose between them. One was the brother of the missing woman. The other was part of the same system that had shut down the operation 2 years ago. But Harris spoke without pathos, dryly and humanly. "I know you think we gave up. Maybe you're right. But now we have 2 cases within a 40-mile radius. It's not just statistics anymore." For the first time in a long time, Eden felt that someone took his pain seriously. He gave Harris copies of his maps and showed him the places he had been and what he had noticed. Broken branches, strange campfires, even strange footprints that didn't match the search boots. Harris wrote everything down without comment. But at the end, he said, "You're doing a good job. It's a shame we weren't here with you from the beginning." 2 years later, the pain had transformed. It was no longer just screams and tears. It became a quiet background to everything Eden did. He learned to hide it from others, but he knew that this background would never disappear. Every evening, he looked through his sister's box of belongings. There was her notebook with sketches of houses, a few childhood photos, and an old beaded bracelet she wore in school. These things were the only things the mountains couldn't take away. One fall day, he was sitting in a bar by the road where truckers often stopped. The local news was on TV, a short story about dangerous areas in the Appalachians and a recommendation not to travel alone. Eden stared at the screen and clenched his fists. The anchor was talking about statistics, but for him, behind every percentage was his sister's face. He left the bar and stepped out into the night, feeling the cold wind pushing him back toward the mountains. He understood. 2 years had passed, and he still had no answers. But now he wasn't alone. Detective Harris had appeared in his world, who also saw something more than random tragedies in these forests. They worked together for the next few weeks. Harris brought him reports. Eden brought his maps. They sat at a table covered with markers of different colors, forming a chaotic grid. Sometimes it resembled a child's game, but for them, every line meant someone's fate. "Look," Harris poked the map with his pencil. "Tourists have been disappearing regularly in these areas over the last decade. Not all cases have been solved." "So it could be a series?" Eden looked up. "I'm not saying yes, but I can't say no either." Those words sent a shiver down Eden's spine. For the first time, he felt that the search for his sister was more than just a personal tragedy. It was a question that could explain not only her disappearance, but dozens of others. On the anniversary of her disappearance, Eden went to the same ridge where, according to cell phone towers, her signal was last detected. He sat down on a rock, closed his eyes, and listened to the wind blowing through the branches. In his pocket was an old compass that he always carried with him. The needle trembled and pointed north. He said aloud, even though he knew no one could hear him, "I won't stop, even if it takes another 2 years." That same fall, When the leaves turned red and fell from the mountains into the valleys, Detective Harris called him in the middle of the night. His voice was serious, without hesitation. "There's a new lead, and it could change everything." Eden felt the flame that had almost died in his chest reignite. He knew that 2 years of silence were over. Several more months passed after the second anniversary. Jasmine's case remained cold, but for Eden, it was a daily reality. He had grown accustomed to the weary nods of sympathy at the local police station, as if to say, "We've checked everything." Only Detective Harris would call from time to time and say in an even tone, "I'm working on it, just slower than we'd like." Then one day, he called Eden to meet him at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. The location was not chosen at random. It was always so noisy that you couldn't hear other people talking over the coffee machine and the constant opening and closing of doors. Harris placed a thin folder on the table. On the first page was a familiar name, Nathan Hale, Jasmine's colleague and longtime friend, the one who was supposed to go hiking with her but had supposedly fallen ill on the day of departure. "We need to talk about him again," Harris said, opening the folder. "There are details that were overlooked at the time." Eden grimaced. "You know he was a friend. They knew each other for years. He would never—" "I'm not saying anything," the detective interrupted. "But there's financial data. He was in serious debt at the time. He didn't show up for work the day after Jasmine disappeared, and several witnesses saw his car closer to the trail than he said he was." Eden felt a wave of anger rise within him. It was hard for him to even listen to this. Nathan wasn't just Jasmine's colleague. He was part of their shared memories. He was someone they celebrated birthdays with, went to concerts with, and discussed nonsense with. "Are you saying he framed her?" Eden snapped. "Just because he has money problems?" Harris calmly took a sip of coffee and looked him straight in the eye. "I'm saying we need to check it out, and do it right." That same week, they met with Nathan. He agreed to talk, but he looked tense. His eyes were red, his hands fidgeted. When he saw Eden, he tried to smile, but it was weak, like an old Band-Aid about to come off. "I already told the police everything," he began. "I really had a fever that day. You can check." "We checked," Harris said coldly. "Your doctor confirmed that you made the call. But a neighbor saw your car near the mountains that same day." Nathan raised his head sharply. "She was mistaken. I told you. I didn't go. Jasmine decided to go without me." Eden felt something heavy growing in his chest. He hung on every word and saw Nathan's lips twitch nervously. He didn't know if it was a sign of lying or just despair, but the image of his sister going alone because her friend had backed out at the last minute now hurt even more. After the meeting, he and Harris sat in the car in silence for a long time. The rain beat against the windshield, as if emphasizing their thoughts. Finally, Eden spoke. "I can't believe he could be involved, but I can't ignore it either." "You don't have to believe it or not," Harris replied. "We just have to check it out." He opened his notebook and showed him a list. Places Nathan had been in recent days, his phone calls, bank transactions. It was all part of a new, shadowy version of the story. A version in which the person Jasmine trusted most could have been involved. For Eden, this was a new challenge. He found himself realizing that even his memories were being distorted. The laughter at the party, the trips with Nathan, the jokes. Everything now had a hint of suspicion. Was there something he hadn't seen? Was there a shadow behind the friendly words that he had stubbornly ignored? One evening, he found a photograph in his sister's box of belongings. She and Nathan were laughing, holding a map in their hands. On the back was her handwriting. "We'll never get lost when two people are looking in the same direction." Eden stared at those words for a long time, unable to decide whether they were proof of her trust or bitter irony. Meanwhile, Harris continued his work. He gathered materials and submitted a request for a new investigation. There was no official response yet, but deep down, they both knew that suspicion had fallen on their friend. Eden walked home through the night streets with only one thought in his head. If Nathan turned out to be guilty, Jasmine's disappearance would be a double betrayal. Not just of the mountains, not just of fate, but of the person they both trusted. 6 years was too long to live on hope alone, and too short to learn to live without it. That was how much time had passed since that September morning when Jasmine's phone had last shown signs of life. To the world, she was just another story in the statistics of disappearances in national parks. To Eden, she remained the center of his existence. In the early years, he stubbornly returned to the Appalachians. Even when the official search had long been called off, even when his friends refused to go with him, he went alone. He packed the essentials in his backpack: a flashlight, a compass, old maps faded from the rain, and a photo of his sister in a plastic bag. Each expedition ended the same way, with emptiness. And with each passing day, that emptiness weighed heavier and heavier. Eventually, the rhythm changed. His trips became less frequent, but longer. He would go for a week and wander the mountains until his strength gave out. Then he would return to the city, fall into bed as if he had been to the front, and sleep for days on end. No one at work asked why he was absent anymore. He had long since lost his job as an architect, leaving only odd jobs to keep a roof over his head. His apartment had turned into an archive. The walls were covered with maps, printouts, and photocopies. There were arrows, stickers, and dates on the boards. It all looked like a chaotic brainstorming session, but Eden saw a system in it. It was his own Jasmine case, which lived in him even when the world had forgotten about it. Years passed, and even the pain changed its character. The tears and screams disappeared. What remained was a quiet, dull weight inside. Eden learned to live with it, like a chronic illness. In the morning, he would wake up, make coffee, and open the map to make sure he remembered all the markings. Only then could he go out into the world. Anniversaries became a special test. Every September, he would drive to the same path, sit on a rock near the place where he had last received her phone signal, and leave a flower there. Sometimes it was a daisy, sometimes a pine branch, a small sign that he remembered. Once, he found someone else's flower there. A stranger had also left a mark. It was the only time Eden felt that his pain was shared. Over the years, much had disappeared from his life. Friends had drifted away because they couldn't stand watching him live in the past. His relationship with a woman who had endured his obsession for almost a year ended in a quiet breakup. She said, "I can't compete with a ghost." Eden didn't argue. He didn't even try to keep her. Because in truth, his heart was tied to the silence of the mountains. Years passed, and the community itself began to treat Jasmine's story as a legend. From time to time, articles appeared in the newspapers. The Appalachians have taken another person. And next to it, a brief mention. As in the case of Jasmine Kensington, who disappeared in 2017. And that was it. Her name became part of the cold statistics. For Eden, it was like a betrayal. He attended local search parties, listened to stories about new cases, and always remembered his sister. Some people nodded, others looked away. Everyone knew the story, but no one wanted to talk about it anymore. One day, 6 years after her disappearance, he was sitting in the university library, leafing through old maps. A student was browsing through literature for her term paper. Seeing his folders and pile of notes, she asked, "Are you a researcher?" Eden paused for a moment. "No," he replied after a pause. "I'm just looking for someone." She said nothing. She just nodded, as if she understood more than she could say. 6 years of silence. It wasn't complete silence. It was filled with the wind in the mountains, the buzzing of insects, the sound of rain on the roof of his apartment. But inside, it meant no answer. Eden sometimes caught himself thinking that maybe if they had found even a body, he would have been able to let go. But it was this emptiness, this uncertainty, that kept him going. Over the years, Detective Harris had become the only person with whom he maintained regular contact. Their conversations were brief. Anything new? Nothing yet. But even this nothing was important, because it meant that the case still existed. That somewhere on a shelf, among hundreds of others, the file with her name on it had not been thrown away or forgotten. On the 6th anniversary, Eden went back to the mountains. Now he walked more slowly, because years of searching had worn him out. His knees ached from constant walking. His hands shook with fatigue. But he kept going. At the place where her phone was last seen, he sat down on a rock and took out his compass. The needle, as always, trembled, pointing north. 6 years, Jasmine, he whispered, and I'm still here. At that moment, it seemed to him that the silence around him had become even heavier. It was as if the mountain itself was listening to him and waiting for someone to dare to go deeper and uncover what it was hiding so carefully. 6 years, and it seemed that history had frozen. But just when the pain had become a daily background noise, and when no one was expecting any news, the first sign appeared that this silence would not last forever. For in the mountains, where silence had reigned for years, a strange signal began to sound again. 6 years of silence seemed like a final sentence. The mountains closed their mouths and kept the secret, as if they themselves had come to terms with the fact that people disappear from time to time, and it is better not to talk about it. But in the fall of 2023, the silence suddenly cracked. 3 amateur geologists from the university arrived in a remote area of the Appalachians to test new equipment for measuring electromagnetic vibrations in rock. Their goal was purely scientific: to record data on ore deposits that could indicate the presence of underground water. Among them was 29-year-old Frank Larson, an overly curious individual who sought out anomalies even where others saw nothing. Next to him was Sarah Lamb, quiet and methodical, and the youngest of the group, graduate student Thomas Milton, who believed that their expedition would yield nothing of interest. They set up their equipment on a narrow clearing in the autumn forest, where red maple trees burned like fire. Suddenly, the sensor beeped, short, sharp, then again and again. Frank frowned, checked the settings, and connected a spare antenna. But the signal repeated, a clear electromagnetic wave that shouldn't have been there among the rocks and moss. "There's something here," he said, pushing aside the leaves to look under the roots. "This isn't natural." They followed the signal, which led them deeper into the forest. There were almost no paths, only wet undergrowth and slippery rocks. After an hour of wandering, they came across a narrow crack between boulders. A cold draft blew from it, like from an underground cellar, and that was where the detector showed the strongest readings. Thomas sighed. Maybe some cables or fragments of military equipment. There used to be military exercises here. But Frank was already climbing down. He shone his flashlight into the darkness and saw something metallic glint in the depths. The narrow beam revealed the body of an old two-way radio. The find knocked them out of their routine. The device looked as if it had been wedged between the rocks on purpose, as if someone had left it there deliberately. The plastic was cracked, but the battery compartment looked relatively new. Frank carefully pulled out the radio. What he saw inside made his heart beat faster. The batteries weren't rusty. They had scratches and signs of use, but they definitely hadn't been lying there for 6 years. Someone had replaced them much later. Sarah noted the time and coordinates as required by expedition procedure. Thomas paced nervously around her. "We have to turn this over to the police. It's not just scrap metal." The news spread quickly. Within a few days, everyone in the local area and Detective Harris's office knew about the strange find. When he called Eden, his voice sounded as if he was holding back something important. "We've got a signal. We've received a radio transmission from deep inside the cave, and it's not old. It was working a year ago." Eden's heart skipped a beat. He had lived with silence for 6 years, and suddenly there was proof that she could have survived longer than anyone thought. "Are you sure?" he asked hoarsely. "As sure as you can be when you see batteries that haven't crumbled to dust." They drove to the place together. The road wound its way through the mountains, and then they had to continue on foot. In autumn, the forest seemed both beautiful and hostile. A carpet of yellow leaves hid potholes, and the wind whistled through the bare branches. Eden walked ahead, clutching the old compass in his pocket, as if it could tell him more than just the direction. Frank and Sarah were waiting for them by the crack. They explained everything again and showed them where they had found the radio. Eden's flashlight illuminated a narrow passage leading into the depths. A damp, cold air wafted out. "We only went in a few meters," Sarah said. "It's dangerous to go further without equipment. But the air is coming from inside, as if there's a large cavity." Harris called in a special team of speleologists. The next day, they descended, equipped with helmets and ropes. Eden stood above, listening to the crackling of the radios, which transmitted fragments of phrases. "There's a gallery here. We can see pieces of fabric. Nothing critical." An hour later, they brought the backpack up. It was gray, with a torn zipper. Eden recognized it immediately. It was his sister's backpack. His hands trembled as he touched the fabric, still damp with condensation. Inside were a sleeping bag and a few small items: a flashlight, a burnt packet of matches, a bottle with a label that had already rotted away. But the worst thing was that there was no sign of human remains. She had been there, and she had moved on. This discovery hit Eden like a thunderbolt. All these years, he had lived between "she died" and "she could have survived." Now the evidence screamed that she had survived at least for a while after her disappearance. She had gone down into these caves, she had lived here, lit fires, and tried to stay in touch. In the evening, as they returned to the city, Harris spoke first. "Now it's a completely different story. This isn't about an accidental fall. It's about survival, and maybe what happened after that." Eden listened, his eyes fixed on the dark outline of the mountains in the car window. It seemed to him that the same mountains that had been silent for 6 years had finally decided to give a sign. But the sign was not an answer, but a new mystery. At home, he sat in the dark for a long time, holding his sister's backpack in his hands. He touched the fabric, which had absorbed the smell of the cave, the cold dampness, and the smoke from the fires. He felt a shiver run down his spine. She was very close. She was living in darkness, waiting for help. And now the question arose: why hadn't she come out into the light? The strange signal was the point at which the story came to life. 6 years of silence were replaced by a single sign, and now everything that seemed frozen began to move. Eden felt that an even more terrifying truth awaited him than the silence. Because worse than silence is knowing that she was there, alive, fighting, and then she disappeared again. The news of the discovery of the radio quickly spread beyond the quiet confines of the university. In the corridors of the local administration, the words, "she was working recently," sounded like a death sentence. For most people, it was a curiosity, but for Eden, it was a blow to the chest. For 6 years, he had lived with the belief that his sister had died that same day. And now the reality was even more terrifying. She had been alive for much longer. Specialists from the technical laboratory took the device. It was battered and scratched, but the battery compartment looked too fresh. When Harris and Eden were invited to the laboratory, he insisted on being present. He didn't need to look at graphs and tables. He wanted to hear the verdict from those who knew electronics better than he did. The radio lay on the table, taken apart. An engineer, a man with small glasses and nervous movements, explained, "This model came on the market in 2014. If the batteries had been in here the whole time, they would have corroded the contacts in 6 years. But here, it's been used for a year and a half, 2 years at most." He placed some photographs on the table, traces left by alkaline electrolyte. They weren't there. For the first time in a long time, Eden felt the ground slip from under his feet. The chair beneath him felt cold, and the air in the office suddenly thickened. He could barely whisper, "So, she used it after 2021? "There is every reason to believe so," replied the engineer. He didn't sleep that night. Images flashed before his eyes. Jasmine sitting somewhere deep in a cave, her hands trembling as she inserted the batteries, pressing the button, and only a faint signal coming out that no one could hear. He could hear her voice in his head, as if it were imaginary. "Eden, I'm here. Why aren't you answering?" And that made it even worse than the silence of the previous years. Harris remained practical. He assembled a small group for a new phase of the investigation. "This is no longer just a disappearance," he said at the meeting. "We have evidence that a person lived for years after the official closure of the case. That obliges us to keep digging." Everyone understood. The case was back on. But at the same time, it was like a death sentence for the system. Because if she was really alive somewhere nearby, then her cries for help had not been heard when she could still have been saved. Eden began to go to the mountains even more often. He tried to sense where she might have been. He climbed down into crevices and listened to the cold wind blowing from the caves. And every time, he thought he could hear the echo of voices. He would sit down near the entrances, take the compass out of his pocket, and say quietly, "You were here, and you held on." The scariest thing was realizing that someone had access to that radio after she disappeared. Either someone else or her. Harris didn't rule out any possibilities. He dug up old records and found everyone who could have been in those areas: poachers, hunters, illegal ginseng gatherers. "If she left the cave in 2022, he said, showing Eden the photos, "someone could have seen her. The only question is, why didn't anyone come forward?" The conversation with Nathan also reignited with renewed vigor. Eden ran into him at a coffee shop by chance. The silence between them was heavier than any words. Finally, Nathan spoke. "Did you hear about the radio?" "Yeah," Eden replied curtly. "So she was alive? Do you understand how this changes everything?" Eden looked at him coldly. "It changes one thing. You all gave up too soon." Nathan lowered his eyes. A chasm hung between them that could no longer be bridged by memories of parties and friendly outings. Meanwhile, in the lab, the radio case was examined under a microscope. Scratches resembling fingernail marks were found on the plastic. The engineer cautiously suggested, "Someone could have nervously scratched the case, pressing too hard. This is typical of people under stress." Eden stared silently at the marks. He imagined his sister, exhausted, sitting in the dark, clutching this piece of plastic in her hands and scratching it because she couldn't do anything else. Society woke up. The headlines were back. The Kensington case has been reopened. The television showed photos of Jasmine with the caption, "May have lived until 2022. For most people, it was sensational. For Eden, it was personal hell. He sat at home, listening to the TV and clutching his sister's backpack, which he had found in the cave. The announcer's voice sounded indifferent, detached. No one felt what he felt. She was there, right there, and they had lost her a second time. In late fall, Harris called him again. "There's more evidence," he said. "The trap camera from last year captured a female figure near the area. The image is grainy, but experts say it's her." Eden felt the ground fall away beneath his feet. His sister was alive in August 2022. This confirmed the worst-case scenario. She had left the cave. But then, she disappeared again. All these pieces fit together into one terrifying picture. She was alive. She fought. She found her way out. But on the very threshold of civilization, something went wrong. And now Eden understood. Their mission had changed. They were no longer looking for a tourist who had disappeared in the mountains. They were looking for a woman who had survived hell and disappeared a second time after she had been rescued. That night, he sat on the floor of his apartment, maps and newspaper clippings spread out in front of him. He looked at his sister's photo and repeated aloud, "I know you fought, and I will find out what happened to you." It was dark and quiet outside the window, but now the silence no longer seemed final, for it echoed with the same strange signal from the cave that had broken the silence after 6 years. After the walkie-talkie incident, the next step was to explore the cave itself. Now, it was no longer just a hole in the rocks where nothing important could be found. It was a place that held the answer to how and where Jasmine had managed to survive all these years. The speleologists arrived in the morning. 3 experienced men with helmets, ropes, and heavy bags jingling with carabiners. Their appearance was almost like a landing party. Clear commands, checking knots, securing fastenings. Eden stood nearby, clutching a thermos of coffee, unable to take his eyes off the dark crack in the rock. It seemed to him that the hole was breathing. A chill emanated from it, along with dampness and something else. A heavy silence that lurked behind dozens of meters of rock. Harris approached and said briefly, "We're going in deeper. Secure everything. You stay up here, Eden." He nodded silently. He understood that it was dangerous to go down without special equipment, but his fingers still clung to the rock, as if he could hold his sister by holding on to this cold edge. The searchers worked slowly during the first few hours. The narrow passages forced them to crawl on their stomachs, pushing rocks aside. Several times they had to knock away protrusions to squeeze further. Eden heard snippets of conversation on the radio. "Left turn, 3 meters. We need a crowbar here. We can see the first traces of ash." These words took his breath away. Ash. That meant a fire. A few hours later, they brought out the first items: a burnt piece of fabric, the remains of charcoal, and a stone with sooty edges. Everything was immediately packed into sterile bags. Harris bent down and looked. She lit a fire here, more than once. These words were proof. Jasmine didn't just fall into the cave and die. She made herself a shelter. When the speleologists returned in the evening, they told us more. The cave turned out to be a whole network with several chambers and branches. One of them led to a second entrance, much wider and easier to exit. There, near the exit, they found animal bones, deer, hair, several broken skulls. "She hunted," said one of the explorers, pointing to the bones. "There are chop marks here, and they were made with stone tools." Eden listened and couldn't believe it. His sister, an architect who had spent her entire life designing houses, learning to walk with a laptop and a thermos of coffee, had suddenly turned into a person who lived in caves and made spears from pieces of wood. In the deeper chambers, they found several primitive structures: a small platform made of broken branches lined with stones, traces of charred bones similar to bird bones, and another package, a piece of tarpaulin wrapped around small items, half a lighter, a gnawed pencil, a piece of glass from a bottle. Harris picked up the package carefully, as if he were holding something sacred in his hands. "This is a survival kit," he said, "and it wasn't put together by accident." For Eden, each find was like a blow. He looked at these charred items and imagined his sister sitting in the dark, surrounding herself with fire, trying to write something with a pencil on a piece of paper, hunting small animals. She didn't give up right away. She fought for years. The speleologist's report was a cold document, but for Eden, it was almost a chronicle of her life after her disappearance. It clearly stated, traces of a fire in at least 3 places, animal bones with characteristic cuts, use of debris as tools, probability of prolonged human presence. Most importantly, they found fresher layers of ash dating back no more than 2 years. This coincided with the time the radio was working. In the evening, Eden sat at the entrance to the cave. He sat there for a long time while everyone gathered their equipment. He touched the stones, feeling how cold and damp they were. It seemed to him that a piece of her warmth remained there. And in this darkness, for the first time in a long time, he felt nothing but fear. He felt respect. She had done it. She had held on. She had lived in these stones when the whole world thought she was gone. Harris, getting into the car, summed up, "We have confirmation that she lived here for a long time, but that's not the end of it. The question is, why did she leave? And where did she go?" The question hung in the air. Because if she had come out, why hadn't anyone else seen her? Eden couldn't sleep for a long time that night. He saw the cave with its galleries, fire pits, and bones. He saw imaginary footprints on the damp ground, heard the crackling of the fire, and felt the silence pressing down on everything around him. He realized that the mountain had given him an answer, but not the one he wanted. It showed that Jasmine was alive, but it didn't say where she was now. The cave network became a new map, a new node in his own investigation. Eden sat over the plans drawn up by the speleologists and saw more than just cavities in those lines. He saw his sister's path, her struggle, her survival, her silent diary, written with fire and stone. And he knew that an even more difficult discovery awaited him, because the one who lived in darkness had one day come out into the light and disappeared there. When the speleologists confirmed that Jasmine had lived in the caves for many years, everyone waited for the next step. It seemed that nothing could be worse. Thinking about her in the darkness, near homemade fires, among animal bones, was unbearable. But in the fall of 2022, another detail emerged that turned the case upside down. Detective Harris received a message from the Forest Service. One of the gamekeepers had found strange images on a camera trap hanging on an abandoned trail near the cave. The camera had been set up to track wild animals, but among the dozens of pictures of deer and bears, there were a few that made his heart sink. There was a person in them, a woman, exhausted, in torn clothes, with long hair falling over her face. She was walking down the path, leaning forward, as if every step was painful. The grainy black and white photo couldn't capture all the details, but one thing was clear. The lines of her face and cheekbones were unmistakable. It was Jasmine. Harris didn't wait. He drove to Eden himself. He found him in an apartment that had long since resembled an archive. He placed the printout in front of him. Eden couldn't look away. He felt as if his heart was about to burst. She was in the photo. Not 6 years ago, not in his imagination, not in his memories. A year ago. She had come out of the cave. She was alive. This can't be fake? Eden's voice trembled. No. We checked the file metadata, the date. It's August 22nd. Eden didn't sleep that night. He laid the photos out on the table and looked at them over and over again. The grainy black and white image became a living scene in his mind. She was walking down a path, stopping, looking back. Did she know she was being photographed? Was she looking for people? Was she running away from someone? He imagined how she, exhausted after years in the dark, finally came out into the open. How she felt the wind on her face. How she saw the sun through the branches. And how she took a step toward civilization. But instead of finding help, her trail disappeared a few miles from the highway. Harris assembled a team to comb the area. They set up dozens of new cameras, followed every possible trail, and interviewed hunters and fishermen. No one had seen anything. Not a single new clue, not a hint. It's like footprints in the snow that disappear with the first rays of sun, Harris said, looking at the map. She was there, and in an instant, she's gone. For Eden, these images were both a curse and a blessing. A curse because they proved she had survived, but still disappeared. A blessing because now he knew she had been fighting all these years. She hadn't broken after the fall. She hadn't given up in the darkness. She had reached the very edge of civilization. He sat at the table with the photo at night and spoke aloud, as if to his sister. You did the impossible, you got out, and I'll find out what happened next. Local media fueled the interest. Newspapers wrote, "Woman who disappeared 6 years ago caught on camera." Television reports showed a grainy image in which the figure looked almost ghostly. Journalists called her the Ghost Woman. For Eden, it was like a knife in the heart, because to him, she wasn't a ghost. She was his sister, alive, real, the one who had walked that path. One day in a bar, he overheard a conversation at the next table. 2 men were discussing the photo. It's just some vagrant. The mountains are full of them. Or it's fake. Who can tell these days? Eden got up and left so he wouldn't attack them. He wanted to shout, "That's my sister! She lived there for 6 years!" But instead, he went out into the cold night and clutched the compass in his pocket, as if it could keep him from breaking down. Harris, meanwhile, continued his work. He retrieved all the surveillance footage from the cameras on the nearby roads. He checked the license plates of cars that had passed through the area on August 22nd, but not a single frame showed a woman who looked like Jasmine. It was as if she had dissolved between the forest and the highway. Either someone picked her up, Harris suggested, or she turned off the road herself. But where? The question hung in the air. For Eden, everything had changed. Whereas before he had gone to the mountains to find traces of the past, now he was searching for a path to the present. He walked along the paths where the camera had captured her, staring at the ground, looking for the slightest clues. A shoe print, a crumpled leaf, a handprint on the bark of a tree. Every sound in the forest seemed like an echo of her footsteps. In the evening, when he was alone, it seemed to him that she was looking directly at him in the photo. Her grainy eyes, hidden under strands of hair, seemed to ask, "Why didn't you find me then?" Eden couldn't answer. He only promised himself that he wouldn't stop now. So the ghost on camera became a new stage in the story. He didn't give an answer. He only gave an even bigger mystery. She was alive. She had left the cave. She was walking down the road. And then she disappeared. And that was even scarier than the first disappearance, because now Eden knew she had had a chance. And something or someone had taken it away from her. The photo from the camera trap was the last proof that Jasmine was alive. Grainy, black and white, but real. She was walking down the road, bent over from the weight of years and struggle. But she was walking. And then, nothing. No cameras, no witnesses, no traces. The road that was supposed to lead to civilization disappeared with her. Eden drove down that road again and again. Day and night, rain or shine, he walked for miles, staring at every turn, every ditch. 4 miles from that spot, the highway began. Logically, she should have gotten there. But no surveillance cameras at gas stations or stores had recorded a woman matching her description. Detective Harris filed another report. Last recorded movement, August 2022, trail coordinates, further route unknown. The paper looked like a dry document, but to Eden, it was a cold knife. The fact that she had been there, and the fact that she was gone again. He and Harris questioned all the residents of the surrounding huts. An old hunter said he heard a woman scream in the middle of the night, but couldn't remember when. A woman from a small town claimed to have seen a strange traveler near the store, but the description didn't match. There were dozens of theories, but none of them led anywhere. "It's like a shadow," Harris said one evening. She was there, but the light changed and the shadow disappeared. Eden felt that this second loss hurt even more than the first. Back then, 6 years ago, he could at least think she had died instantly. But now, he knew she had lived. She had fought. She had come out into the light. And then, she had disappeared. What could have happened between the camera and the highway? There were various possibilities. She could have gotten lost her strength, fallen, and died. But then, there would have been traces. She could have fallen into the hands of someone who didn't want anyone to know about her. This version seemed the most likely, and the most terrifying. Journalists began writing articles with sensational headlines. "Disappeared twice. The ghost of the Appalachians." Eden hated those words. To them, she was a sensation. To him, she was his sister. He turned off the TV when the story came on, but the photo from the camera trap still lingered in his mind, even when he closed his eyes. One day, he went back to the place where she had been caught on camera. He sat down on the ground, placed the photo in front of him, and stared at the path. The sun was setting, and long shadows of trees fell on the ground. He whispered, "You were so close. Why didn't you come?" The wind lifted the dry leaves, and they swirled around like an answer he couldn't hear. Harris, meanwhile, tried to stick to logic. He analyzed every meter of the road. Could she have turned off? Were there any hidden paths? Finally, they found an old wooden bridge over a stream, overgrown with moss. There were traces on it, but too old to prove anything. If she turned here, Harris said, she could have been missed on the highway. But where did she go? The question hung in the air. For Eden, life was divided into before the photo and after the photo. Before, there was endless silence. After, it was even worse. Living hope shattered by a second disappearance. He began to lose track of time. Days merged together. Nights were torn apart by disturbing dreams. He dreamed that she was walking down a path, reaching out her hand, and the shadow of an invisible figure grabbed her by the shoulder. He woke up screaming and sat in the dark until his heart calmed down. Weeks passed. The case was again transferred to inactive status. Everyone felt that the trail had gone cold again. But now, this story could no longer be lost among the others. Because there were photos. Because it had been proven that she had survived. Eden couldn't accept it. He knew that someday the answer would come out, whether in new evidence or in someone's accidental confession. Mountains don't hold secrets forever. On the anniversary of that night, he returned to the path. He sat down on a rock and took out his old compass. The needle, as always, trembled and pointed north. He looked at it and said, "You've come a long way, and even if the road leads nowhere, I'll keep going." He got up and walked along the path, retracing her last steps. The trees rustled above his head, and darkness crept between the branches. And he walked stubbornly, because he knew that even if the world had forgotten, he remembered. That's how the story ended. Not with an answer, but with an even greater mystery. Jasmine Kensington, the woman who disappeared in the Appalachians in 2017, survived a fall, lived in caves, came out into the light, and disappeared again, now almost on the threshold of civilization. For the police, it remained an unsolved case. For Eden, it was an eternal promise, because the road she took did not lead to the city. It led to silence. And now his life has become that same road, endless, without answers, but with the determination to keep going as long as he breathes.